That new high-tech TV you bought might just be spying on you. USA Radio Network's Chris Barnes has more.
This is not a conspiracy theory. This comes from the FBI, which is warning that smart TVs with internet connections and facial recognition capability are vulnerable to hacking. And even without a hack, that technology could allow the manufacturer and app developers to keep an eye on you. A malicious actor could do everything from change your channels to spy on what you do and say when you're near your TV. And for USA Radio News, I'm Chris Barnes.
And you're listening to USA Radio News.
Welcome back. It is me, the Jeff Santos Show that you're tuned into. And as we speak on MSNBC is a representative from the great city of Seattle, Representative Jaya Paul, and of course a well-known journalist has been able to interview her many times. He happens to be our next guest. He is, of course, the Renaissance man, Jeff Santos Show. He's a journalist. He is a musician, and he is on at 5:30 almost every week. Except last week we had to change some things around. He is Mark Taylor-Canfield, and we welcome him to the broadcast. Mark, how are you, my man?
Oh, Jeff, I'm doing good. You know, we had a whole week-long series of events around the 20th anniversary of the massive protests here against the World Trade Organization. So I've been doing a lot of writing and coverage of that. And so that's, very interesting. There are some stories, I think, that really tell the tale of the WTO protests that we should probably get into, including the militarization of police, mass violations of people's civil rights, and the genesis of a whole new form of independent media called the Seattle Independent Media Center. So those are the kind of issues that I've been concentrating on in my coverage. My letter on this issue was published in the Seattle Times on November 30th, which was the day that those protests started in 1999. And then my song, which is called The Ballad of N30, which was the code word for the day. N30 stood for November 30th. That song is going to be released on YouTube this week as part of the commemoration. And then this weekend, the whole other series of events, including Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz is going to be speaking, so I'm hoping to interview him. So that's what we've been up to here, Jeff.
Well, you got a lot on your plate, as you normally do. Of course, besides being a great reporter, he is, of course, always playing, venues like the Showbox and other small theaters and bigger venues as well. Is Mark Taylor-Canfield. Mark, I want to get into looking back at those protests against the WTO, but I want to just sort of get your thoughts about today's impeachment issue, because we see your good friend, Representative Jaya Paul, on MSNBC as we speak. She has got a very big role. I don't know if she's endorsed yet. A lot of people say she's probably endorsed Bernie, but I know she has an alliance with Elizabeth Warren as well. But she is, part of the Progressive Caucus handling the Medicare for All in the House. She's also, of course, involved in the impeachment hearings. She's talking about it now. Talk to me a little bit about it. She's in a very interesting position, because it's not a seat that, that somebody's going to challenge her, because she's a pretty progressive person. I doubt anybody will run from the right or the left. And she gets put herself in a position on this healthcare vote, where she's very prominent. She's obviously very prominent on this impeachment stuff. Talk to me a little bit about this Jaya Paul.
Well, she has been a true progressive fighter since I first met her years ago, when she was an immigrants' rights activist out on the street, shouting on a bullhorn outside of the INS detention center here in Seattle. So she's always been a fighter. She's always been a woman who wants to represent other women, especially women of color. And I think that she's really done a great job of taking over for Jim McDermott after he retired after 14 terms, which is, we should call him the Pharaoh or something, I don't know. But, having terms that long, it's like the 1,000-year reign of a dynasty or something. But, he was so popular that he won some of his elections by 80% of the vote. And then along comes Pramila Jayapal, and she runs for his seat, and she wins 80% of the vote. So Republicans can't touch her. She's got pretty good progressive creds in the community. I also know her husband, Mike Williamson, is a former head of the King County Labor Council. So they're both great people. They're really upstanding members of the community, and they've always been up for the good fight, the fight for the working people. So, I think that will probably continue, and the fact that she's getting a national spotlight does not surprise me at all, because she's been one of the most outspoken new members of Congress. And when you have folks like her and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar and folks like that in the Congress, things are going to change. And she's part of that vanguard, for sure.
Well, she's front and center on a lot of these issues. So going back to what happened with the WTO, you mentioned police violence, police brutality, and so forth. You were tear gassed, I believe. Back.
Yes.
Give us a little understanding of what that was like and how you have seen other states, other cities come under more scrutiny and as protests develops, whether it's on Black Lives Matter or other issues from the Carolinas to Florida to New York City, etc.
Yes, well, I can tell you a little bit first before I explain that. The background of this is that I did write an article for a National Lawyers Guild report about the militarization of police in the United States after the WTO demonstrations. And I was also a founding member for a group called the Committee for Local Government Accountability. And we oversaw the city's official investigations into these civil rights violations. And then our report went on to the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York City. So, yes, there were a series of protests that took place all week, starting on November 30th, and lasting till about December 7th. But then I have to tell you, Jeff, and this is one of my first experiences of Seattle, too, was, riot cops, robocops in body armors, slamming their nightsticks against their shields and scaring the crap out of people. And also the indiscriminate use of pepper spray, tear gas, concussion, flash grenades, all sorts of projectile weapons, including rubber bullets, all of which are considered potentially lethal. Now, they like to call them, quote, less or non-lethal, unquote, weapons, but they can be lethal. And there have been incidences, and there was an incident here in Seattle where people had been shot in the eye with a rubber bullet. That's also been a problem in China. So projectile weapons can be very, very dangerous. That's why sometimes protesters, you'll see them wearing goggles because they don't want to lose their eyes. I mean, it literally does happen sometimes with those weapons. And they can also injure you seriously in other ways, too. And the National Lawyers Guild has done some good work on this. But because of all of these violations of people's civil rights all week long, where there was this ever-increasing no-protest zone, where basically political dissent, was illegal, which is a direct violation of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which says that we have the right to peaceably assemble to address our grievances. Well, the large majority of the protesters in Seattle in 1999 were nonviolent. They were practicing nonviolent civil disobedience by sitting down in the streets and locking down at the hotels and trying to keep the delegates from going to this conference, which they considered to be a very undemocratic institution that violated state sovereignty, that weakened environmental and labor laws, and was pretty much the plan of a bunch of super elite global bankers, right? And they didn't feel like, we had a voice, that the common people had a voice. So imagine as a young man, or pretty young, I come into Seattle thinking like, I'm going to go do some music here, and tear gas, pepper spray. I'm running with a cameraman from Brazil, and he was trying to get to this shop called Pro Tape to get some memory for his camera or something. And on the way, we got tear gassed. And it was like that. People trying to get home from work got tear gassed and pepper sprayed. There was a police riot, especially in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. And so, tens of thousands of people took to the streets, including a lot of labor unions, church groups, environmental groups. The famous game changer here was that you had steelworkers marching with people dressed in sea turtle costumes from Greenpeace.
Right.
And that was the first time that had happened. So it was really interesting. And By the way, this is a kind of a side story because I can talk a little bit more about the civil rights violations. But when the cast from the film Battle in Seattle had their premiere screening at the Seattle International Film Festival here, I actually got to interview the actors and the directors. So Charlize Theron, Andre 3000 from Outcast, Michelle Cunningham from Survivor, and Stuart Townsend from Queen of the Damned. He basically produced this film, which was an independent film. They got together with Woody Harrelson and said, hey, let's do a film about what happened in Seattle. And so it was pretty much, directed and produced by Stuart Townsend. But I got to party with them, which was a really interesting experience, and just talking to them about what their feelings were about it, watching it from halfway across the country or the world. And they thought about, being a part of that project. And they were all very into it. I mean, they were trying to do something that they thought was unique. And then they did invite a lot of us. I was an extra, actually, in the film. They did invite a lot of people that were there to come down to the set and hang out and be in the film. So that was pretty cool. But those stories about the militarization of the police, what was going on is you had, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was stuck in her hotel room and couldn't get to the conference. So she was calling the mayor and ranting about, clearing the streets, threatening that otherwise President Bill Clinton wouldn't attend the conference. Well, they couldn't clear the streets. They ended up calling a state of emergency. A no-protest zone was established in downtown Seattle, which was challenged several times by people who would walk into it, carrying a briefcase and wearing a suit and tie, and they'd be let through. But anybody wearing a sign or handing out copies of the Bill of Rights, in one case, were, harassed or arrested. So over 600 people were arrested. The jails were full of protesters. So there was a lot of jail solidarity going on, too, where people were actually camped out and protesting outside the jails, demanding that people be released. So meanwhile, the conference pretty much ended in a shambles. The African delegates walked out. They thought they were getting a raw deal, and it fell into disarray, and it was a huge mess. Unfortunately, of course, the WTO organizers kind of walked away and left Seattle with the mess, which was millions and millions of dollars that we weren't covered for, millions of dollars in civil rights lawsuits paid out in settlements to people who had their rights violated or who were injured. We don't know how much money because a lot of those suits were settled with non-disclosure statements involved, so nobody had to take on any blame or accountability for what happened. But it was a mess. I mean, you had these cops running wild in Seattle, sort of like during Mayor Daley's Chicago Democratic National Convention. And then, as you mentioned, that model for crowd control using all of these CS gas, which is a chemical weapon and is actually banned by the Geneva Convention during wartime, by the way. The National Lawyers Guild, the ACLU, the Trial Lawyers for Public Justice, and a lot of other advocacy groups on civil rights came to town. The ACLU tried to clean up what was happening in the King County Jail, because once you start arresting people and throwing them in the jail system, then they start reporting abuses of prisoners. So that became an issue. I don't think that was ever completely cleared up. That was never adequately addressed, even though the ACLU came here and had a conference about abuse of prisoners in jails, sort of pointing their finger right at the King County Jail, hoping that something would happen. But, in the end, it did set back the WTO organization for many years on their agenda for this sort of corporate globalization, privatization scheme, where they sort of have moved into countries like the IMF and the World Bank, and just basically rewritten laws in countries around the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there is a scenario here. If you look at the protests that happened in 99 and 2000, and then you look back, to 2009 and the Occupy Wall Street, and of course the protests that have gone to Black Lives Matter, the rallies that Bernie Sanders has done against big corporations. This really has been developing. Again, the incubator was against Seattle. As you have been many times, whether we're talking about the immigration issues that you guys were very early on against Donald Trump, winning the Attorney General there, winning the lawsuit, to the issue of the minimum wage at CTAC. Seattle, once again, and that's why I brought up Cheyenne, Paul, because she's in the middle of all this, representative from your great city there. I think that a lot of people can point to Seattle, again, as sort of the incubator, not only of protests, but of understanding the corporations. And, of course, you have the biggest one of them all right now at Amazon, and they tried to win buy the election there just, a couple of weeks ago. And keep an eye on Seattle, folks, because what happens there usually comes to the rest of the country, sometimes the rest of the world, going forward. So it's been a fascinating, 20 years to look at it, Mark, and you've been there documenting all of it. It does seem that there is a sense that it will happen in the West first and then make its way across the country, eventually to New York and D.C. and Boston, et cetera, in many, many ways. And, we're gonna see, because Sanders is the next president. He obviously did very well last go around in places like Washington State and Oregon, to a lesser extent in California, which there were a lot of votes that were seemingly just thrown aside for Bernie in California. We all remember that the election was called the day before it actually happened for Secretary Clinton, which is unheard of.
Yeah. Seattle's an incubator, right? But at the same time, the protests against corporate globalization had been happening in the global south for years. In Bolivia, Mexico, India, people had come out by the tens of thousands, 80,000 people in the street to protest the privatization of their water system. Suddenly they can't afford to drink water, things like that. Privatization of education. So we're still fighting that battle. And now we have we have multiple major corporations in Seattle. For some reason, we've become the choice for corporate headquarters for a lot of tech firms like Google and Amazon. Other folks spend a lot of time developing computer and software technology. And the thing is that we still have this very progressive culture here, so there's been a cultural clash. There are other legacies of the WTO that are not quite as pretty, and that would be like something you mentioned, which is this model for policing that was then used all across the country at other international trade agreement protests, like the FTAA protest in Miami, major GATT and NAFTA protests. There was the Republican convention in New York City. It took place shortly after the demonstrations in Seattle. Because of this terrible corporate spin, which is another issue here, Jeff, the Independent Media Center started in Seattle during those demonstrations, and that's where I cut my teeth as a journalist. I'd written articles before. I was editor of my school newspaper and things like that, but I hadn't really taken journalism to the streets, so to speak, until Seattle. And then they had this Independent Media Center, which had a storefront downtown, but they also had a website, which is where most of the activity took place, and people were uploading all sorts of video. Citizen journalists were invited to come into the center and, borrow a camera and go out on the street and film and bring back the footage so that they could upload it. And so every day there was a digest of all these reports from the street, and I noticed that there was a big difference between what people were reporting on the street with their the amateurs with their cameras and the corporate media, because the corporate media, of course, was concentrating only on the burning dumpster and the broken window and the kid with the hoodie on, taking the Nike sign down. But there was a lot of other issues happening, and a lot of these civil rights violations were not being covered by the media at that time. In fact, at one point, the city of Seattle denied that they were using tear gas or pepper spray, and I went to Capitol Hill after hearing these huge explosions and concussion grenades going off, thinking that somebody had bombed my neighborhood. But when I got there, I found all these tear gas canisters all over the streets, rubber bullets, all sorts of projectile weapons everywhere, because the police were just using them indiscriminately. And I immediately grabbed all that stuff, put it in a bag, and the very next day went to a church where Jim Hightower was, the former Secretary of Labor from Texas, was broadcasting with Ralph Nader. And I came running in with this bag of stuff, and I put it down on the table in front of them, and I said, "Look, guys, this is what they're using on us out in the streets." And they immediately went on the air and started demanding that the city stop beating protesters, stop using these so-called less lethal weapons against the protesters. But unfortunately, that modeling that they used here for militarization of police, including the armored personnel carriers and the use of CS gas and all this stuff, has been replicated in other cities, unfortunately. And we found out later that the chief of police in New York City before the GOP convention there said, we're not going to let the city burn like they did in Seattle. Well, just to set the record straight, folks, I think one dumpster burned or something, but other than that, there were no arson fires. In fact, no one was killed, and firearms were not involved at all. It was just demonstrations in the streets and broken windows occasionally and things like that. But the way that the media spun it was these violent demonstrators, and so the chief of police in New York said, we're not going to let that happen. Well, he used the Seattle Police Department as consultants when the city of New York had the Republican National Convention. They ended up corralling hundreds of people and arresting them. The city of New York had to pay, millions of dollars in civil rights violations, suit settlements, just like Seattle.
To add another point to it, if you know a mentor of yours and somebody who's a great journalist, Amy Goodman, was arrested, manhandled in the protest zone in 2008 in the Republican convention in Minneapolis. Where we have a tremendous amount.
I was covering that. Yep, I remember that very well.
Yeah. So
and I've been arrested myself as a journalist. That's the other legacy, Jeff, that we didn't talk about is the arrests of journalists and the pepper spraying and tear gassing of journalists. So there's no discrimination, whether you have a press pass or not. I was arrested at the state capitol during the Occupy movement. The very beginning of it, before it ever started in New York, there were sit-ins at the state capitals like Madison and Olympia and Washington State to oppose the budget cuts, the austerity measures that were coming down, which is also a part of corporate globalization, by the way. But and I was arrested, but I won my federal class action civil rights lawsuit, and the judge, Robert J. Bryan, the federal district judge, said it was a violation of the freedom of the press for them to arrest me, because then I couldn't report on the workings of my own government, which is something that you do in a police state. You just start arresting protesters and journalists. But that's happening in countries all over the world. And I'm trying to fight that as an editor and reporter myself. But when I see it in my own country, it's really disturbing. And we did see that. Associated Press reporters got arrested. It's sort of like an idea. The idea is just clear the streets by rounding everybody up, and then you sort it out later. And then they end up paying out, major lawsuits and things like that. But, that's the legacy of these demonstrations. And I think the whole story hasn't been completely told. But, that's up to people like me. I guess we're going to have to write a book.
Corporate media are the ones that have to tell it, and you can't depend on them to tell the truth, as we have found out, not only in this election cycle with Bernie Sanders, but in general, on police protests and so forth. Again, I point back to the Black Lives Matter protests that have, and obviously along the way there might have been a broken window and so forth, but it wasn't like it was happening every day by these same activists. And this is what the perception is from Republican governors. I was thinking of a North Carolina episode of protest, and we saw the tanks roll out in Ferguson with the protests there and the military hardware that, looked like you were going into war in Beirut, except it was Ferguson, Missouri. So all of these things are unfortunately still happening, still very tragic, and becoming more and more of a fascist state. I don't like to throw that word around, but, there have been episodes. We've had episodes of this. And, of course, the leader of the country at this current time is one that actually praises, strong dictators, therefore with an alliance with Putin. Doesn't exactly, have civil liberties as first and foremost part of being the Russian leader.
Yeah. When you see riot cops, banging their shields with their clubs, staring at you, and it really, you realize that you're facing corporate fascism at that point. And we saw that on the streets here in Seattle. And I have to say two things. One, the Independent Media Center in Seattle went on to be replicated by over 200 websites across the world, including China, although they kept shutting it down, of course. And it's a citizen-based journalism website where people can post stories from their own neighborhoods, from their own communities. It's called the Independent Media Center, but, Philadelphia has one, New York City, L.A., Los Angeles, San Francisco. They're all over the world now. And that was a model also that was replicated from Seattle, I guess, a part of that embryonic process. So a lot of people like Jill Friedberg had something to do with that. She the documentarian who made This Is What Democracy Looks Like, which is the most well-known documentary about what happened on the streets in Seattle. She had a screening. People took to the streets and blocked streets in front of the Washington State Convention Center as part of the anniversary celebration, and they projected video on the convention center where the original ministerial conference for the WTO was taking place while people blocked the streets, and they painted this huge thing in the middle of the street that says democracy pointing in one direction, WTO pointing in the other. So a lot of it has to do with people wanting to have a voice, and this idea that people will just go out on the streets and protest because it's cool and they want to get on TV and they want to get arrested because they have nothing better to do that day. That's ridiculous. People only do that kind of thing. They only sit down in the middle of the street and put their bodies on the line when they're so frustrated by the political system and by the economic system that they see no other way to express themselves, when they're not allowed any other way to express themselves. There's no media for them. There's no politicians speaking for them. So you look at the young people that are fighting climate change today, and this is a sort of an ongoing movement, I think. You're right, the Occupy movement and
really the only way
today.
they can potentially, get their word out is to take to the streets. So this is the civil rights movement going back into the 50s and 60s. Mark, we're going to run, my friend, unfortunately. We'll talk to you next Tuesday. Have yourself a great week, and we will talk to you on Tuesday at 5:35 Eastern Time.
Sure.
All the best, my friend.
We can check me out at MTC Report on YouTube and Democracy Watch News, and my articles at Truth Out. And go Greta Thunberg. We'll see you next week.
Go do it. Thank you, Mark. I want to thank Tony Lopes and his team there in Taunton, Massachusetts, for broadcasting today, putting this together. It's been a long day. We thank them. We thank Mark Pacheco for giving us the platform. This is Jeff Santos. We'll be back tomorrow in studio. Right now, it's my time to say hi. Gotta go.
USA Radio News with Tim Berg. The House Intelligence Committee has released the final report on impeachment. The report from the Democratic-led panel says President Trump placed his own personal and political interests above the national interests of the United States. Now, regarding impeachment, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says there's a myriad of options of how the House passes articles of impeachment against the president.
Senator Schumer and I could work out an agreement on what the procedure would be in the Senate. Failing that, 51 senators of any particular persuasion could work out a procedure for handling it.
California Senator Kamala Harris says dropping out of the presidential race is one of the hardest decisions of her life, but her campaign simply doesn't have the money to continue. She told supporters in an email it's becoming harder and harder to raise money needed. And you're listening to USA Radio News.
An official message from Medicare.
It's open enrollment, Fred. Time to compare plans.
Oh, Alice, we're fine with what we have.
Well, that's what the Johnsons thought until they tried Medicare's new Plan Finder.
The Johnsons, huh?
We saved on our prescription costs.
And got extra benefits. Come on, Fred. Maybe we'll find something better.
Plans change every year. Use the new Plan Finder at Medicare.gov to compare health and drug plans. Open enrollment ends December 7th.
What do you know? Comparing plans really pays.
Voting on a new UAW contract for Fiat Chrysler workers could start as early as this Friday. A tentative agreement was reached on Saturday, and on Wednesday, union leaders will meet in Detroit to decide whether or not to send the contract to rank and file for a vote. That new high-tech TV you bought might just be spying on you. USA Radio Network's Chris Barnes has more.
This is not a conspiracy theory. This comes from the FBI, which is warning that smart TVs with internet connections and facial recognition capability are vulnerable to hacking. And even without a hack, that technology could allow the manufacturer and app developers to keep an eye on you. A malicious actor could do everything from change your channels to spy on what you do and say when you're near your TV. And for USA Radio News, I'm Chris Barnes.
And you're listening to USA Radio News. There's talk in Washington, D.C. that President Donald Trump may not be impeached, but rather censured by the House of Representatives. And according to Florida former Attorney General Pam Bondi, who's now serving as special advisor to Trump for the impeachment, she says that would not be a good idea by Democrats.
The president did nothing wrong. Censure is not acceptable. How can it be when you did nothing wrong? This process has been a sham from the beginning. The president did everything right, and they continue to attack us every day. You know it. The American people know it. And now, what do they want to do this week? They want to bring in a bunch of academics to pontificate on whether or not the president did anything wrong. That's not going to fly with our lawmakers. It's not going to fly with the American people. And we will continue to go on the offense. This is a sham of a proceeding, and we're not going to accept it.
Oshkosh police say a school resource officer shot a 16-year-old student after being stabbed. Oshkosh Police Chief Dean Smith describes what they believe happened early in the investigation.
It was determined that there was an altercation at the SRO's office between the officer and a 16-year-old student. Initial reports saw that the student produced a weapon and stabbed the officer, at which time the officer fired on the student, striking the student one time.
It was the second straight day that a school resource officer shot a student during a confrontation at a Wisconsin high school. For USA Radio News, I'm Tim Berg.
The Supreme Court is focused on that issue, as well as what is the definition of a quid pro quo.
So if military aid or security assistance is part of that quid pro quo, where in the July 25th transcript does President Trump ever suggest that he intends to withhold military aid for any reason?
He doesn't.
That's Republican Congressman John Ratcliffe of Texas and George Washington University law professor Jonathan Turley. President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump are on their way back from the NATO summit, and you're listening to USA Radio News. Florida Senator Rick Scott is slamming the International Olympic Committee for keeping the 2020 Winter Games in China. Scott previously pushed the IOC to move the Games out of the country. The IOC responded by saying they would stay politically neutral and keep the Games in China. And you're listening to USA Radio News.
Revolution. He is acknowledging that it doesn't work for him unless, you have just this massive shift in how our politics works, i.e., first element we've already seen, a campaign funded by the grassroots rather than funded by big donors.
Right.
That, so check that box off. Second, a campaign that relies on a massive level of on-the-ground activism, less on TV than on, just a human push and a human pull. He clearly has that developed, I think, in Iowa at a very high level. In New Hampshire, it looks pretty strong. California, it's looking stronger, and he is really emphasizing that state. Nevada as well. So, you can probably check that off, too, and say that's likely to be the reality. There will be grassroots activists really doing the work. So then you get to, that final element, right, which is, you've got the ideas, you've got, some alternative model for resources. You've got the activists. Even when he does all those things, he still has to win big. He can't win, by a narrow margin, because remember, the superdelegates come in on the second ballot. So he's got to win great big victories to give him, a dominant position in delegation. The only way you're going to do that is with a massive increase in turnout. And, all these candidates talk about increase in turnout when they're running against Donald Trump, if indeed they are, in November of 2020. But for Sanders, he's got to have that massive turnout increase at the caucuses.
Yeah, you've got to do it now. Yeah.
Yeah, and those are the elements that come into play, and they're very, very big. Like I said, I think he's checked off a number of the boxes, which is pretty amazing.
It is.
Now comes the next challenge, that's the final challenge, which is, as I suggested, massive turnout increase. I mean, you almost, like in a state like California, I would suggest to make this work, you've got to be approaching, maybe not reaching, but approaching November level turnout in a primary. Will it get there? That is still an open question. Nobody should deny the complexity and the difficulty of that. If it does, if Sanders gets, if you see lines and lines of young people at the polls, right, then you have that real prospect that he could win big enough that he can go into that convention, probably pulling together with Warren backers and some people from other campaigns, and potentially beat the establishment. Remember, though, that has only happened once or twice in the modern history of politics.
Yeah, we're talking McGovern and, I guess, to a lesser extent, Obama, right?
You nailed it.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. McGovern is a true outsider, and then they abandoned him in November, right?
Of course.
The establishment
right.
forms Democrats for Nixon. Obama, different game in a sense, different strategy, in that he was an outsider. There's no question. He was taking on a lot of the establishment. He did have to fight them, but he had Teddy Kennedy and some other major players on his side.
Right.
So that made it a
little... et cetera. Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. It was, the McGovern thing, it may be a little bit closer, hopefully with a better result.
It would have a better result.
Yeah.
No question.
But here's something I've been thinking about. I think you're exactly right, as you normally are, John Nichols of The Nation magazine. It seems to me that on one hand, he has to motivate people under 40, because that's the folks, particularly college kids and those, who are in need of massive change on climate change, on health care, maybe for their parents or their grandparents, lessons for themselves in most cases, and just for their own futures. And I think that they have to do that, and that has to be the priority, to get these people out to vote. But he also has to, at the same time, saying that it's a revolution. But let me just tell you a little bit about how revolutions start. They start with agendas. And the agenda of FDR and Truman and Kennedy and LBJ before Vietnam's escalation in +66 really is what we are trying to do. We are trying to get free college. They did that in the 1960s with Berkeley. We want to do Medicare for all. Truman wanted to do that in the 1940s. Roosevelt wanted it as a second Bill of Rights before he died. We talk about more civil rights and Medicare. LBJ did Medicare, and obviously he had the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Bill. So all of these things have been done before. And I think the reason you want to say that over and over again to people who are over the age of 50 or 60 is because there have been bombardment, is that this guy is a radical loony bin coming down from the spaceship with E.T., as his running mate. And I think that it's really important, that it is critically important, that you do both. Your thoughts?
That's right. No, you're exactly right. I mean, look, when you're in a situation like this, Bernie Sanders, if he is to be the nominee, is not going to get it easy. Mm-hmm. And he's not going to get it on the margins. It's not going to be a narrow win. And so you have to look for him. He's got to look at those people who are rock solid with him, as you suggest in polling, and a lot of his backers really are very low, but also who are, not necessarily constant participants in the political process. And that's where the young people come in. I mean, the fact is that under the age of 40, even more under the age of 30, mm-hmm. The numbers for Bernie Sanders are astronomical.
Yes.
And if we had voting in the United States at the same level that we see in most European countries for young people, if they turned out at that level, I think, and it's a little bit of margin, but he would have come much closer to it, maybe even have been the nominee in 2016, right? It would have been just that variable. But he got a lot of youth turnout in 2000, or younger voter turnout in 2016. It wasn't sufficient. It's just got to be dramatically more this time for him, to get where you're talking about. And part of what's happening, which I think is a little bit undercovered in our media, because our media skews old,
right,
and our media doesn't tend to pay attention to these things, is when he gets support from people like Jack White of the White Stripes, and when Ariana Grande is tweeting mm-hmm. about him, and when Mark Ruffalo today, I believe, endorses him,
right,
a big movie star. When these things happen, that has resonance with younger voters who are able to appropriately and wisely do a blend of culture and politics, right? That they do know people in the political sphere like Mark Ruffalo who've been really involved in environmental.
Sure.
And so
got a movie coming out on it.
And these are people who vet, if you will, for younger voters, and maybe get them enthusiastic, one hopes. But Sanders is going to have to use all that. And he's also going to have to use the endorsements he's gotten and highly emphasize them. Candidates don't always do that. Often candidates, tend to like to be the center of attention for themselves. In Sanders' case, he's got to share that spotlight with people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez,
yes,
who really is a vital backer for him,
and a rock star,
as well as others. Yeah.
Well, it's come to that time, Mr. Nichols. We wish we had more. One of these days we're just going to do a whole hour with Nichols and give you the whole thing. But I just wanted to sort of, the morning consult poll, which came out yesterday, had Biden at 29% and 25%, actually at 20% for Bernie. But when it came to the states, that's when it changes. And just 30 seconds before you leave here, to me, the problem that I see is that Biden, I don't see the momentum at all for him. He obviously has a lot of internal establishment and older support. But
yeah, well, he's got the name recognition.
He got the name recognition.
Yeah. But the fact of the matter is that Joe Biden has already run a remarkably uninspiring and I think largely ineffectual campaign.
Mm-hmm.
With all the advantages he has, he really hasn't taken off in the way that you would hope to have in a front runner. It isn't that he's failed. He has held his lead, sometimes more narrowly, sometimes a little wider. But I think it's a very, very thin advantage at this point. And I do think that we haven't even talked about Bloomberg. Look, here's bottom line. Why is upper 70s white guy with relatively centrist stands getting into the presidential race at this point? It is because the other upper 70s white guy with relatively centrist stands doesn't seem to have locked things up, right? That's the bottom line. Bloomberg wouldn't be getting in if people thought that Biden had nailed the thing. So that's your proof of that right there.
Well, it certainly is. I think the proof is, as they say, in the pudding. My friend, always great talking to you, John Nichols. We will talk to you next Wednesday at this time. Have yourself a fantastic day, night, and week. All the best.
Take care, my friend. Bye-bye.
You too. All right, this is the Jeff Santos Show. We're back in a flash. Welcome back. It is indeed the Jeff Santos Show with our producer here, Joe, in the house. Say hello to his dad, who's stopped by to say hello. Folks, one of the things that, as I've been saying for a long time now, if you've been listening to the show over the years, Revolution Radio Network, and by the way, you can go to Revolution Radio Network and listen to the show. It clicks right into Hometown Talk Radio here. Teaching, educators, teachers are the most important profession in America. It's hands down. Nurses are very close because they take care of the sick, obviously. But if you lose the future, we have the future here sitting right next to me. He's a high school student here producing this broadcast. If you lose that group of people, you don't let them get fully blossom what they want to do, whatever it is they want to do in life. If you lose them, you lose the country, because that's the future. Future dries up, you can forget about a democracy. It's that simple. All right. With that, our next guest is somebody who deals with this every day. She is the executive director of Badass Teachers, best name in politics. She is Melissa Tomlinson, and she joins us on the phone. Melissa, how are you?
Good. How are you, Jeff?
Doing very well. Doing very well. I hope you are too. We normally, of course, speak to you on Tuesday. We had a conference yesterday. I hope that went well. I want to chat a little bit about how important it is for people who are, in high school right now, and even in elementary school and middle school, as you divide it up, to understand how their government works. And the reason I say this is that, we just talked with a whole bunch of people, and the fact that, civics isn't taught in a lot of places in this country any longer and hasn't been for 40 or 50 years. there also is a responsibility, obviously, to teach, other things as well besides government. But if you do not understand what your government does and what it doesn't do, then you have no idea how you get your electricity, how you get your gas when you become an adult, how you do a whole slew of different things, how you grow food, where you buy a house. All these things are somewhat connected to knowing how a government, a small town, a big city runs. And I'm just wondering, as you talk to your fellow educators and so forth, if they think that, look, particularly because we don't teach civics, that we really need to spend time making sure that we are doing our job as teachers to inform and educate these young minds. Because if we just omit it and this, follow the line of this SAT nonsense of just teach to a test, we're really doing malfeasance in a lot of ways to future generations. Your thoughts?
We are, if we don't kind of uphold that responsibility of making sure the youth knows the systems that are in place and how to disrupt those systems. Not necessarily teach them, this is what you need to do, disruption, but how they can make change. It's funny that you're talking about this, because there was a recent announcement from the Department of Education about Opportunity Growth Zone grants that Betsy DeVos is putting forward, that's basically sending $63 million directly to charter schools and charter school expansion. And in order to stop that, you have to know how the government, your state or your local municipality government, is going to go about applying for the funding and ways that you can make sure your voice is heard to kind of put a stop to that or to reduce the amounts that they do. So it's not just the broad overall picture of civics, so this is how a bill is made, but it's really important to know those details and knowing where opportunity for public comment and public opinion can be heard, and making sure you take advantage of those opportunities. And if we don't teach our youth that, we're going to end up even more so having things occur to us without us, and then we know that it's not necessarily for us.
Well, I just think, we're talking to Melissa Tomlinson here on the Jeff Santos show, that it is that is so critical. I mean, we talk about all the time, how we're now living in a global community. We're now living, where competition is everywhere. It's in the Middle East. It's in South Africa. It's in the Far East Asia. It's everywhere, right? And, maybe 40 or 50 years ago, when people were coming of age in the 60s and 70s and so forth, you didn't have as much competition for jobs as we do now. A lot of it, of course, has been by, I think, malfeasance by government leaders that give trade deals and so on and so forth, that people lose jobs that, were once in places like Michigan and Ohio and, New Bedford and New Jersey and Massachusetts and New Jersey and so forth. But, they're no longer there, and that has obviously hurt those communities. What I guess is important here is to basically, give people an understanding that, you could be the smartest person in math or science, and that's important. We know there's always been that issue, with the American educational system. But all that goes nowhere if you don't understand how to apply that to your life, to work around government. So, I mean, that's why, to me, it's such a critical thing. I mean, I knew a lot of brilliant people in high school and college, who were amazingly brilliant, but, couldn't understand. I mean, I remember having a discussion with a person who wanted to go overseas and do international business. I said, well, do you know how to speak a different language? Well, no. Well, I mean, I think that would be a good, important thing if you want to, go. I think he was thinking about Japan or someplace. I just think that there needs to be an understanding of sort of the simple, basic elements that sometimes I think get avoided when we're thinking, we got to get better math and better this and better that. There's some other elements that go into it.
There is. It's ties into the global picture, right? Especially in America, I find that we're very, I think the term is ethnocentric, right? We tend to raise our children with the idea that our country is the center of the universe, basically,
right,
and that they can easily go over to another country and expect everybody to speak English, right, and that they won't have any problems. And the two main subjects that we emphasize, math, which has almost little to do, unless you really are intentional about teaching cultural competency, and math has little to do with analyzing math in other cultures, and English language arts, which pits our language as the number one language. It's, how many years of just learning about English and about authors, American authors mostly, and about the ways our complex language works, writing in our language. So it's very centered around us in this country, and we don't do enough justice in bringing in those other areas, especially in a social studies curriculum. Again, a lot of those courses we do teach, like world history, but they're world history based upon America's role in it for the most part. So it still becomes a very centered study program.
Talking with good friend Melissa Tomlinson here on the Jeff Santos Show, Executive Director of Badass Teachers here on the program. We have talked about, candidates running for president and the element of charter schools. And I want to go there for a second because you had mentioned not long ago, it was last week or the week before, about Elizabeth Warren's, dancing, I guess, maybe the best word, with charter school folks. And explain to me, for people who are not aware of the distinctions with charter schools and the dollars that go there and don't go to other public schools, particularly inner city, and how this affects. And when Democratic candidates, particularly those who are in the progressive lane, have Dalian school folks, who, of course, put a lot of money into candidates' pockets, and how that really not only makes your job harder, but makes the likelihood of more and more people, quote unquote, being left behind, as in, of course, the No Child Left Behind thing that the BS of the Bush administration, Bush 2. Talk to me about that, because I think that a lot of people, a lot of progressives, that word is so loosely defined these days. I myself call myself a populist progressive. I think that is something that needs to be explained. So do some time on that, if you might.
It's interesting to watch the narrative of charter school versus public school kind of played out in the media, and how specific groups of people that have a vested interest are almost using voices as their talking pieces for pro-charterization in areas. And all that does in the end is put money in their own pockets. I mean, yes, the people may get grants for writing some of the pieces that they write, or doing these town halls that we've been seeing lately, or pulling parents together and going like to Elizabeth Warren's, one of her events, and protesting and saying that they have a right for choice. But choice is really just an illusion. And when you look at the populations where these charters are being mostly placed, it's in the black and brown marginalized communities. And it's basically making a profit. I'm not even going to say basically, it is. It's making a profit off of families of color, where they don't realize, and this goes back to civics education, they don't realize the avenues that they have and that they can utilize to make their own neighborhood, community, established public school better by advocating for the resources and for the funding that school deserves and that their children deserve.
Well, I think that's so important. I mean, I think time after time we have seen, African American parents, concerned about, a lack of funding, and therefore they want to see the best for their children, and they're given choices like, you can either go to charter school and maybe there's a chance of, if you're a kid, maybe he's one of 5 or 6 students that will actually get an education, or you can stay behind and let the superintendent and let the school committee and everyone else, defund the school, close the school, not improve it. It's on the front page of the Globe today, where there's rat-infested, schools that have not been fixed in 25 years. And that's what ends up happening. They're never the choice about, if you understand that providing and saying yes to charter schools, the whole system, now your neighbors, Johnny and Sheila and Marcia are left behind. Because, you're putting in a situation where, maybe you make it, but the ladder is pushed down so nobody else can make it. I think all of those things come into play, and people are like, this is what my choices are?
Yeah, it feeds into that feeling of, I want to do what's right for me and mine and not worry about the rest of the community, right? I'm going to make sure my children are provided for and not think about the other children in the community, like you were saying.
Right.
And we know now, and we've known, but we're realizing it even more, that that's not how we can continue in society today. We're working hard, progressive voices, to change that narrative and realize that in only being concerned about your own little world has damaging effects. I mean, you can relate it to what's going on with climate change, right?
Sure.
You have what you need, and basically the hell with the outside world, and that has consequences. And we need to kind of wake up even more and realize that those consequences are damaging to the future.
Especially one, that's actually not a direct quote from what you said today. It sounds a lot like what you've argued today.
President Trump has wrapped up meeting with world leaders at the 2019 NATO summit in London. Now, Vice President Mike Pence says one of the things the president is very good at is using our strong U.S. economy when it comes to trade talks, and even people paying their fair share when it comes to NATO.
The president's also been willing to use the power of this economy and access to this economy and tariffs to leverage changes in our trading relationships. It's working for the American economy. And as we go forward with negotiations, the American people can be confident that this president is going to continue to be willing to use access to this economy and use tariffs to put American jobs and American workers first.
The vice president speaking there on Fox Business. Gun background checks in the United States are on pace to break records in 2019. With the details, here's USA Radio Network's John Hunt.
Background checks on gun purchases in the United States are climbing toward a record high this year, reflecting what the industry says is a rush by people to buy weapons in reaction to the Democratic presidential candidates' calls for tighter restrictions. By the end of November, more than 25.4 million background checks, generally seen as a strong indicator of gun sales, have been conducted by the FBI, putting 2019 on pace to break the record of 27.5 million set in 2016, the last full year Barack Obama was in the White House.
For USA Radio News, I'm Tim Berg.
You are listening to the voice of Southeastern Massachusetts for news, sports, and talk. AM 1530 WVBF and FM 2599 DD 99.7 Middleborough, Taunton.
Has not. That Trump would never stoop to investigating a political rival, because everyone knows this is how he operates. The case has been so clearly made, you wonder what exactly the Senate will be left doing. With the trial coming so close to an election, Republican senators will probably decide to let the people decide. Since our country is so bitterly divided, that's the best way to go. The hearings haven't changed voters' minds, said Jennifer Agesta, in CNN.com. Support for impeachment remains exactly the same as it was in October. 50% of Americans say Trump should be impeached and removed from office, while 43% say no. Democrats have only themselves to blame for their failure to move the needle, said Noah Rothman in NBCNews.com. It's undeniable that Trump abused his power for personal gain, but Democrats have seized on the term bribery, hoping it would resonate more with voters than abuse of power or blackmail. These rhetorical contortions have backfired, allowing Republicans to argue that Trump didn't actually receive or give any bribes. Trump's worst crime is his assault on democracy, said Adam Serwer in TheAtlantic.com. He tried to rig the 2020 election by blackmailing a weaker foreign country at war with Russia to cook up bogus charges against one of the leading Democratic candidates. It was, in short, a conspiracy by Trump and his advisors to keep themselves in power by leveraging the power of the presidency. The Republic's founders foresaw such a circumstance and created the impeachment clause as a last resort against it. The primary crime for which Trump is being impeached, scheming to defraud the American people of a free and fair election. And in the It Wasn't All Bad section, Xu Bang never thought he'd see the view from Angel's Landing. Having lost the use of his legs to muscular dystrophy, the schoolteacher knew climbing the 5,800-foot-tall rock in Utah's Zion National Park was not an option. But Vang, 29, was recently made that hike with help from 32 volunteers from the health nonprofit F5 Challenge, who used harnesses, a special backpack, and their own strength to carry Vang to the summit. The best feeling wasn't just getting to the top, he said, but having all those people be willing to help me get there. And when Steve Brathwaite was pulled over by a Michigan State police trooper, he was sure he was going to get a ticket. Instead, the officer just wanted to take a closer look at his car, his yellow, banana-shaped convertible. Brathwaite, 59, has spent 2 years cruising America in the custom car as part of his The World Needs More Whimsy Grand Tour.